Hello, this is Rabble Radio, recorded on Friday, September 19th, 2025. I'm Brianne Doyle. Rabble.ca shares with you the news of the day through a progressive lens. If you're curious about what's happening in Canadian politics, labor, the environment, and beyond, you've come to the right place. This is news for the rest of us. Thanks for tuning in. This week on Rabble Radio, we continue our discussion on the state of public education in Ontario. Over the past few weeks, we've heard from various education union leaders about the growing pressures facing students and workers alike, pressures made worse by Ontario Premier Doug Ford's education agenda. One major concern raised again and again, Bill 33. Tabled in May and still making its way through the legislature, the so-called Supporting Children and Students Act would give the Minister of Education sweeping new powers to supervise school boards and mandate police presence in schools. Today, Rabble editor Nick Seebruch sits down with David Mastin, president of the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario, to talk about why smaller class sizes are critical to student success and why having police in classrooms is not the answer. Here are Nick Seebruch and Dave Mastin in conversation. Take a listen.
Hello, I'm here with the president of the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario, David Mastin. David, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So to start off, could you maybe introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself and your union for maybe some of our listeners who aren't aware?
Yeah, sure. My name is David Mastin. I'm the president of the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario. ETFO represents 84,000 educators in the province of Ontario working in elementary schools. Predominantly, our members are permanent teachers, part-time permanent teachers or full-time permanent teachers. We also have occasional teachers who do both daily work and long-term assignments. And we also have some education workers, some early childhood educators, along with some educational support personnel and professional support personnel, a smaller number of those last two groups. So predominantly we're teachers, occasional teachers, smaller number of early childhood educators, and quite a significantly smaller number of professional and educational support personnel.
You were elected as president this past August, and you come into the position at a time when the provincial government seems to be making a few unprecedented moves and proposing some unprecedented reforms to the Ontario education system. Ontario Education Minister Paul Calandra earlier this summer announced the province was going to be taking over some of the province's largest school boards, including the Toronto District School Board, and is also now hinting that he may be changing or abolishing the position of the elected school board trustees. I just wanted to get your reaction to some of these developments.
Yeah, and you use the word unprecedented in your description of what's happening. And I think the definition and the use of unprecedented, unfortunately, has become more and more common, such that I think some of these aggressive moves, both here in Ontario, in Canada, and obviously south of the border, that are significant attacks on our democratic foundations, are becoming more and more frequent. And as much as I'd like to refer to them as unprecedented, I'm reluctantly starting to believe that they're becoming more and more frequent, and therefore hard to describe with that word. So it's making for an interesting transition. We know both at our level, certainly with our membership, we have got an awful lot of work to do. We consider ourselves the protectors of public education in a variety of forms. Governments, unfortunately, haven't been able to protect public education in the way that we think is appropriate. So we do take this very seriously. It's part of our priorities. Our memberships understand this. And so we are up for this struggle if, in fact, this is what Doug Ford and Paul Calandra are expecting. They're going to get a fight on this.
How will what the province is doing change education? How will taking over school boards more directly, like the TDSB, change education in Ontario?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Last week, there was a moment of what has appeared to be a little confusion as to whether or not this notion of taking over school boards was creating 4 big school boards to run the entire province, or whether it was just taking over the board of trustees. It's an interesting, nuanced discussion that most of your listeners and the general public wouldn't understand. But I would definitely characterize those two issues as being substantially similar. Trustees, whether they're removed or whether school boards are removed, the trustees are where big decisions are made, are where the connection with the public is made, the accountability with that local population is made. And if they're not there, regardless of whether the entire school board is removed or whether the board of trustees are removed and replaced with one of Doug Ford's friends who doesn't have any idea about public education, might be a business manager, might be a business expert. This is not what this system needs, and it will drastically impair our ability to tailor education in unique communities around this province the way it needs to be tailored. The concept of public education makes reference to it being owned by the public and by the population. And the public and the population in Kenora is not the same as the public and population in Toronto. And this is the part that is most concerning to us. This transition to a business model for the running of a public service is deeply flawed, and one that we understand, our members understand, and we're going to do our best to make sure that the public understands in enough time for potentially a change in direction.
Now, trustees, in some school boards, and some, especially more rural areas, they can be elected, with only a handful of votes. Sometimes they run unopposed. But do you feel that by removing trustees, that members of the public will be losing a voice in public education?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's no question that they will be losing a voice in public education. Local elected trustees do make decisions that are unique to the communities that they're in. And I can't stress this strongly enough. The notion that there have been some examples of financial scandals, whether it's packs of gum or bags of chips, or even Skydome hotel visits. Every level of government has financial scandals. This provincial government, Doug Ford's provincial government, has had its fair share of financial scandals. And if the higher level of government stepped in every time there was a scandal over spending, Doug Ford's government would have been eradicated many, many, many years ago. So this cannot be the function by which we focus on when we talk about eradicating a level of governance in our system, in our public system. It's a catastrophe. It's a catastrophe. And so our local jurisdictions would pay drastically if this were to come to fruition.
Now, you mentioned financial issues that the province has mentioned with some school boards. But in other jurisdictions, you mentioned at the top of the conversation, south of the border, we've also seen in Alberta, moves to remove books from school shelves. So is there an ideological aspect to what Doug Ford and Paul Calandra are doing to Ontario education?
Oh, I definitely believe that there is. I mean, it's not typically talked about, but there has been certainly this notion that public education indoctrinates our children into certain left-leaning perspectives, whether that's respect for our trans community, whether it's and you can identify any host of progressive conversation that are connected to human rights, that are connected to every one of our citizens feeling safe and comfortable in public institutions. These are not left-leaning ideals. They're human rights ideals. And I do know that this government, and certainly the government in Alberta, the government south of the border, has gone to war on what they call woke ideologies, which I would refer to as human rights issues. And so I do definitely believe that underneath the surface, there is a desire not just to address packs of gum and Skydome trips, but to also rein in and control what is being taught in our schools to the point where we are making our schools less safe for some of our students who do not fit in the mainstream as defined by certain people.
Yes, of course, that can also include programs like DEI, which Doug Ford has been critical of in school boards like the Toronto District School Board.
I didn't mention that, but it's exactly the same thing. All diversity, equity, inclusion programs and advancements are under attack, wrongfully under attack. And there is a very serious push for that to take place. So I do believe underneath all of the packs of gum and the Sky Dome trips, there is definitely a much deeper ideological, authoritarian desire to control everything that transpires.
Now let's talk a little bit more about that financial cover that you've mentioned a few times, the Sky Dome trips, the packs of gum. Obviously, the school boards are all funded by the province. So is it really a matter of the school boards mismanaging that funding, or is it a matter of the province not funding education at an appropriate level?
Yeah, our schools are struggling right now. They're struggling. There's not enough supports for our students that are most in need of those supports. We've got a lot of students for a variety of reasons that are struggling with mental health issues. And I don't want to get into that because it's very complicated, very deep. But the reality is our schools need to provide resources to help students reach their best, to provide an opportunity for every child to succeed. And some of our children are not succeeding right now. This government, since being elected in 2018, has systematically underfunded education to the tune of about $6.3 billion over the course of the last 7 years, which equates to about $1,500 per student since that point. And if you think about a class of 24, and that's on the low end, 35 on the high end, having $1,500 per student taken out of that system, think of what we could do differently in a big picture level to provide the supports that our students need. So getting to your question, this systemic erosion of funding, I believe is all a very calculated project by this government to create a crisis, to create a system that doesn't work, to drive parents out of the public system, to take their public dollars into the private system in order for ultimately this to be handed over to private capital. It's a $30 billion a year industry that private capital would love to sink their wallets into and get access to. And, again, if Doug Ford wants a fight on this one, we're going to fight him on this one, because we know that a strong public education system is necessary in order to provide for the best for every child, regardless of family income. It's what we believe.
Now, you called it a manufactured crisis, and that's a tactic that we've seen from other governments that seek to privatize public services. We've seen it from this government in its attempt to privatize parts of the public health sector. What is the goal behind privatization? Why do they favor privatization over a well-funded public system? Who benefits from that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a multi-step response to that. I think certainly this government, and I would suggest all conservative governments, they lead and they serve one constituency, and they serve the business class. So I do believe that there is that part of it. I also believe that depending on which conservative and how conservative the government is, there is an underlying desire to get government out of the lives of citizens. And that libertarian perspective where people should have the right to choose everything and government should be out of the way is a form of conservatism also in government. And I also believe that this government has a fundamental understanding or belief that if you don't have the means to provide a certain level of service to your family, to your children, then you shouldn't have access to high quality things. So I think there's a multi-step answer to this, but I have yet to meet a conservative government anywhere that doesn't try to erode public services, hand them over to private capital for a variety of reasons. I don't agree with any of those reasons, because I do believe there are certain things that every individual should have access to at the same level, and education and healthcare are at the very, very top of those lists. If we can't provide every child an opportunity to succeed, regardless of your family means and financial means, then we're doing a massive disservice to humanity.
On these issues of the trustees, the provincial takeover of school boards, you talked about fighting back. What is your union going to do in response to some of these moves?
Well, that's a good question, and I'm not totally prepared to answer all of that just yet. But I will say that much of our response will be dependent on being proportional to the violation. Sometimes governments throw out trial balloons to see where they land and see how they might have an impact on people. And we're engaged, I think, in that right now. I mean, obviously, Bill 33 is on the table, and Bill 33 is extremely odious. And we are certainly having conversations internally with our membership, with the school boards that are being impacted. We've got members in those boards in Ottawa and Toronto, in Thames Valley and Toronto Catholic that are being impacted as we speak in this way. But the school year has just started, and some of those impacts haven't necessarily come into the classroom just yet. But we're having those conversations because Bill 33, you could make an argument, is almost like a little bit of a trial balloon for something which is being now talked about that is much greater. So I can't answer you entirely on how our response will be, but I can assure you and your listeners and the government, if they choose to listen, that ETFO is going to fight this.
Now, your union is heading into central bargaining next year in 2026. Obviously, we've talked about, I think, a few of the issues that will be priorities for you. What are some of the other priorities for your union going into that bargaining negotiation?
Yeah, for ETFO, class size is a very big issue for us. And we say that not with the means or with the purpose of eliminating or minimizing other issues. Violence for our members is immense. Extra supports and proper supports for students that are struggling, students that have their needs not being met. These are all at the heart of what we're going to be bargaining for. But we also know sometimes when we're discussing these issues with the general population and with the government, sometimes you have to make things as simple as you can. And class size and reduction of class size has a positive impact on every one of the topics that is of deep concern to our members. And so we're going to come into this round of bargaining focusing on class size, reducing class size, putting class size caps on a certain in all grades. There are some limits to class sizes in the primary grades, and we're looking to see if we can extend those types of conversations into other grades, because we know ultimately all of our ability to deliver high quality public education will be dependent on the number of students that are sitting in front of us and the needs that those students have. I mean, this is not disconnected from the amplifying of the needs that these students do have that are sitting in front of us at this point.
Now, in terms of that problem of class sizes, can you put that into perspective for us about how many students per class and about how much time is each of these students getting with their teacher?
It's almost impossible to quantify that in a way that would sound satisfactory. There's very, very limited one-on-one time that teachers would be able to spend with students. We have classes that are in the 35 range. I know prior to the end of September, which we're not there yet, there are classes, even kindergarten classes, that are up in the 30s. And these are children that are 4 and 5 years old. Almost impossible to deliver a high quality program when classes are that big. So the individual attention, the understanding of the needs that students have, the challenges that students are walking into our classrooms with in any given morning, sometimes they can get buried and lost in the cacophony of the large numbers that are in front of our members. So I think it's very hard for people that haven't been part of public education in the last 15 years to recognize how much things have changed, how great the needs that students have now are, and how the system needs to pivot in order to provide properly for all of those students. It's a very different system than when many of us were there as students. And I think that's important for listeners to recognize.
You mentioned violence in classrooms. This is something Rabble's reported on. It's a growing issue across the country. Doug Ford hinted earlier this year that he'd like to see more police officers in schools. I was wondering, what were your thoughts on that?
Yeah, again, a typical conservative move. Let's use more cops, more guns, more defense spending. These are reactionary at best. And even as a reactionary response, they wouldn't address the issue at all. And certainly in the elementary system, what we need supports. And much like out in the community, we don't need more cops on streets. We need more programs for people that are struggling. We need more assistance for individuals. Those things might cost a little bit more money, but they're sustainable. They will have long-term impacts. They'll impact across different areas that are more sustainable. So, I mean, I know that there are some people that think that's the solution from our perspective, it absolutely is not the solution. And we look at those as they're not even band-aids. They're ways to distract from where the true problem lies. The true problem lies in the fact that these kids need supports. Schools are the best place to provide those supports. This government is not investing in those supports. And so then they see a mess and they turn to a reactionary response, which is let's put more cops in schools. It's atrocious. It's an atrocious response to a real problem.
Absolutely. And just getting to the end of our time, I just have one more question for you. For our listeners who've been hearing about these issues with the trustees, the takeover of school boards, and they may be parents, and they want to get involved in being part of the solution, what advice could you give them on how best to do that?
Yeah, there's a lot of community groups that are forming right now. I know in Toronto area, there's a variety of groups that are forming. Certainly, you can go online and you can look up groups that are looking to fight back against either Bill 33 or the elimination of trustees. You'll find a lot of groups. Certainly, sending messages to your local MPPs, specifically if you've got a conservative MPP, that would be important. Having conversations with people that you know, with your family, around the kitchen table, at church, in the arenas. Talk to people about the importance of trustees, the importance of local governance, the importance of a tailored local approach to public schools, conversations about how Cornwall is not like Toronto, conversations about this Doug Ford government. Do you trust this government to make good decisions on behalf of these kids that are struggling in our schools? ETFO's got a website called Building Better Schools. We would ask you to go to that website, look at how we talk about what we think are ways that we can build better schools. ETFO and all the other teacher affiliates and all the education sector affiliates will be going to the bargaining table at the end of next year. Reach out to them, see what you can do. How can we work together to ensure that public education is funded properly? Definitely lots of ways to do that. But I think at the heart of this, it's about conversations we have with people that we care about.
And on that note, thank you very much, David Mastin, for this interview.
Appreciate it, Nick. Thanks so much.
That was David Mastin and Nick Seebruch in conversation. Thank you so much for that, David and Nick. Switching gears now, this is our In Case You Missed It segment, where we review the top stories from this week on rabble.ca. To do that, let's turn things back over to Rabble editor Nick Seebruch. Take it away, Nick.
Thanks, Brianne. Starting this week with labor news. Post-secondary institutions across the country are under financial strain due to chronic underfunding and also because of the cap on enrollment for international students. This strain has led to massive job cuts, with Ontario seeing over 10,000 jobs cut from post-secondary institutions over the past year alone. Unions are fighting to protect the rights of their workers, with post-secondary support workers represented by the Ontario Public Sector Employees Union currently on strike across the province. Union President J.P. Hornick lays some of the blame at the feet of the province's Conservative government. Hornick said, quote, "As this fight heats up, there are going to be a lot of questions Ontario taxpayers needed answered, especially as jobs disappear and options for students shrink before our eyes." End quote. In Ontario politics, activists are calling on the Ontario NDP to reject Doug Ford's plan to invest in nuclear and fossil fuel energy over renewables. The Ontario NDP under Marit Stiles have indicated their support for Ford's plan to diversify the province's energy economy. Critics, however, say that nuclear power is inefficient and dangerous when compared to renewable solar and wind energy. In an op-ed on Rabble, Angela Bischoff of the Ontario Clean Air Alliance points out that nuclear plants often need to be taken offline for maintenance and that they create toxic nuclear waste which remains dangerous for thousands of years. Bischoff is calling on the Ontario NDP to pass a resolution at their convention on the weekend of September 20th, rejecting nuclear energy in favor of wind and solar. Also this week, in Rabble's Book Lounge, Tom Sanborn reviews This Book is a Knife, Radical Working Class Strategies in the Age of Climate Change by L.E. Fox, an anthology of Fox's essays The book has a strong anti-capitalist, pro-environment message. Fox self-describes as a proudly queer, non-binary, working-class writer and activist. They have published widely as a science writer and social critic. According to Sanborn, Fox is a writer who seems to be able to deftly use many modes and genres without ever losing the fluent and idiomatic style that gives reading them the delights of a good night at the pub with a smart friend. In environmental news, writer Linda McQuaig argues that Mark Carney should focus on renewable energy as a nation-building project. Carney has made funding of projects of national economic interest a priority for his government, and has already expressed his intention to fund Ontario Premier Doug Ford's previously mentioned plans to build more nuclear plants. McQuaig argues that because solar energy has become so cheap and is so hard to hoard as a resource, capitalists are refusing to invest in it and are instead continuing to fund fossil fuel projects that worsen the climate crisis. On top of funding large solar projects, McQuaig is also calling for a National Youth Climate Corps, saying, quote, "Now there's a transformational nation-building idea. It would tackle youth unemployment and alienation and give us all a greater chance to live in a world not dominated by wildfires, floods, and droughts." End quote. And finally, David Suzuki talks about how art can ignite action in his latest column on Rabble. The David Suzuki Foundation funded the National Rewilding Arts Prize in partnership with Rewilding Magazine. The prize celebrates artists in Canada whose work reimagines our relationship with nature and community. The inaugural prize, launched in 2022, drew more than 550 applicants. The winner's work spans textiles, sculpture, installation, photography, and sound. It is on view at the Canadian Museum of Nature in Ottawa until October of 2025. As always, you can read all of the stories we talked about today on rabble.ca.
Thanks, Nick. And that's it for Rabble Radio this week. Thank you as always for tuning in. If you like the show, please consider subscribing to Rabble Radio on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please rate, review, share Rabble Radio with your friends. It takes 2 seconds to support independent media like Rabble. Thank you to the journalists and the writers who contributed to this week's content on rabble.ca, and thank you to Carl Nirenberg for supplying the music. Lastly, thank you to you for tuning in to Rabble Radio. I'm Brianne Doyle, and I'll talk to you next week.